made it clear that when we're talking about continuity management, we're talking about planning so that we can stay in business. That's kind of what we mean by continuity. So it's that kind of thing. Businesses fail. And according to Gartner, um, if there's an IT disaster, maybe 30% of businesses that have that IT disaster will fail after that. Fail as in not be able to go on. And that is a very, very bad thing, because business fails, people go out of work, the business owner loses a lot of money, and people lose their jobs. So it's not kind of great. And so it's obviously something that we want to try and avoid. And so some good planning and having some good tools, and spending some thought and some training, and having some infrastructure in place. These things can help us to sort of avoid that. And that's what we're talking about here. Because, yeah, it can be a big problem. So we have outages. Not all outages are really, really terrible. But some outages are, and that's why we talk about planned versus unplanned outages. Planned outage, supposing you're a company that relies on a very high percentage availability, and I know we've used this word before. Availability is, the percentage. It's a percentage of time that users can access their applications and network. So supposing you're a company or a business or a government body or whatever, and your customers rely on a very, very high availability rate. So you'll still have some outages. And so, for example, I often get a SMS message, a text message from my bank, and it'll say things like, well, this weekend we're going to do an update in our software. You won't be able to use the ATMs between 1 o'clock in the morning and 4 o'clock in the morning on a Friday morning. That's usually the kind of things they do, right? And most people are like, yeah, that's right. I'm planning to be sleeping then anyways, and not going to the bank. But if I needed some money from the bank, I'd probably do it before 1 o'clock in the morning. So that's a planned outage. An unplanned outage would be, just at some random time because of some random event. So planned outages, we have these. And and that's why if you end up as a job, your job might be in supporting some kind of computer networks. Traditionally, we've found that those people, they do work kind of weird hours. So if you're working supporting a network or working supporting servers, you might be doing a lot of work on the weekends and at 1 o'clock in the morning, because that's when you can bring down the system, upload new software, install new hardware without sort of causing huge sort of disruption to your customers. And so there's a lot of work happens there, and those would be things which would be planned outages. So what is a disaster then? So that 2 o'clock in the morning thing that I get a message from HSBC saying you can't use the ATM for 3 hours or whatever. And also I get other messages saying, well, I can't use our online apps either at this time because we're having a major system update. So that is not a disaster. And usually I get a warning maybe 3 or 4 days in advance, and I can plan my things around that. But these are things that could be disasters: power grid failure, fire explosion, natural disaster, terror attack. I don't know if you guys have been following the news. I spent a lot of time in Texas. I actually had a house in San Antonio for a while. I love Texas. It's an awesome place. But what the heck is going on in Texas? I mean, like everybody is asking that question now. And why is that? Because they had a snowstorm, 3 days of snow, and they had people going without power for like 3 days. So that's not good. That would fall into one of these things that would be a disaster, right? And for everybody. I mean, the only people that can sort of get through that are people that have their own sort of backup power. And certainly any organization which has a really high dependency on a high availability rate is probably going to have some backup power. So for example, a hospital, you got people that are connected to all kinds of equipment that keeps them alive and stuff like that. They're probably out the back somewhere. They got a generator. It's funny. There is a solar array in Qatar that I know of. One, and I sometimes go and park my car there because it's down in between the big sand dunes on that. It's almost like asphalt, the road out there. There's a road, right? It's like hard and black because of all the tires going over it, but really it's just compacted dirt. But there's a telephone tower, and it's got a solar array which supposedly powers it. And I went out there the other day, and these solar power units, and this is the problem that they had in Texas, right, with the solar power units and the wind units, is they actually need a lot of maintenance, and you just leave them for a few months, and they're become inoperable. But there at the solar array that powers this telephone tower, they had a diesel generator, and I thought that was kind of funny. But yeah, that's a lesson from Texas, I suppose. So yes, you're right about the water as well. In Texas, the pipes froze, I think, and then people were not able to get water because the water company had to turn off the water because of the pipes leaking water everywhere. Very, very bad. Now, so how does disaster recovery? Well, of course, they're doing all kinds of things to get their disaster recovery going there. But how does sort of our continuity management and planning relate to Texas? Well, obviously, they haven't done a very good job. Now, to give them a bit of a break, the snowstorm that they had, they haven't had anything that bad or those colder temperatures for 30 years. Now, I remember, as I said, I had a house in San Antonio for a while. And back in 2013 or something, like, they were going, oh my gosh, it's like the worst weather ever. It had like 4 degrees of frost or something like that in San Antonio, which is, San Antonio is kind of like Qatar, almost in its weather. So 4 degrees of frost is a lot. They're not expecting that. And they thought that was kind of terrible. And that was like the worst, coldest weather that they'd had in 10 years. But now they got snow on the ground and 20 degrees of frost. So it's not something that they're used to. And so their planning was not too good. I mean, they could have spent a bit more money to do things to have the water so that it worked when it got cold. Because certainly in Canada, I was born in Canada, Alberta, Canada, it freezes all the time, and we always have water, and that's because they planned for it, right? Now, as I said, to be fair to the people in Texas, it probably was reasonable to think that it's not going to get that cold. Anyway, so they got some new planning to do. They're going to have to buy a lot of new infrastructure, and they're going to be hoping that it doesn't get cold like that next year, but it might. So there's, but what I want to mention here, and so that's nice about Texas, but let's talk about these things now, different types of disaster. And so we've actually categorized them here in the 3 different ways. So we got one where the infrastructure is gone and the people are okay. That's the Texas example, right? The power went down, but the people are okay, but they just can't do any work, and they're cold. And that could be because of any of these things. Another situation could be that the infrastructure is okay, but the people are gone. Now, 2020, right? Here we got these lovely colleges and places of work, I suppose you could say, all around the world, and people aren't in them. Schools in the United States, I guess you could say, because of the disease pandemic, and because of that, people can't go to work. And so some businesses have been badly affected by that, particularly if your business was a restaurant business, you might have gone out of work. Now, for IT, though, we did sort of get around that, and it might be because, well, let's face it, and I don't want to sound like a Pollyanna here on this, but when I checked yesterday, 256 people in Qatar had died since the start of the pandemic of COVID. That's, well, I mean, I'll just leave it at that. I mean, it's not, all I'm going to say is it's not like I come to work and I look in my office and, oh, that guy died yesterday. So I'm not going to say any more about it. Right? It's just, yeah, it's not quite like the Black Plague or anything like that. So, yeah, the infrastructure gone and the people gone. Well, that would be like Fukushima, right? I don't know if you're familiar with what happened in Fukushima, but that was the tidal wave came in, and because of an earthquake, there's an earthquake out in the ocean. Tidal wave came in, 100 meters of water washed over the nuclear plant, wiped out the city, and went back out into the ocean. Took all their cars and houses with it. and lots of people who died also. And then they were left with all this toxic damage from the nuclear site, and so the people were gone and their infrastructure was gone. The nuclear site provided power for like half of Japan. And so they had to come up with another solution to that. Yeah, Fukushima was, I don't know if you remember that. That was like 2013 or something. But Fukushima is a farming area in Japan. And Japan, I don't know if any of you have been there. I've been there a couple of times. I love Japan. It's an awesome place. But they are so careful about their fruit. You go to the supermarket, you can buy a piece of salmon for like, I don't know, $2. So you can go and have lunch and have this really good food. But if you want to buy an apple, it's like $5. Mind you, but the apples are really, really good. But the reason why I mention the apples is because they grow them around Fukushima. So, I mean, after that disaster in 2013, there's like 2 years where they couldn't sell any apples because nobody would buy them because they're afraid they're going to get nuked by the apple. Uh, anyway, so there's lots of different disasters, and we just sort of mentioned a few. We got Texas, we got Fukushima. There's lots of other disasters like that. And here's a nice list in alphabetical order of some disasters that may affect your business. And I think I mentioned in the previous lesson about when I worked in the telephone company, they took that really, really, really seriously. I mean, we had redundancy on everything. Actually, for a while there, in the building that we had in the regional headquarters, I had the volunteer role of a fire warden. We have that here at the college too. But as a fire warden, we had to have fire drills and get everybody out of the building. And it was kind of different there. We took it real seriously. I mean, at that work, we used to, everybody, when you came to work, you had to sign the book. You couldn't just walk into work, right? You had to sign the book that you're in. And then when there's a fire alarm, the fire warden would take the book and they'd look at the book and see who's signed in. And the fire warden had floor wardens for every floor in the building. There's like 13 floors on the building I worked in. And then the floor wardens would bring an attendance list of all the people that were standing outside, right? So we'd empty the building, get everybody to stand outside. We'd call the fire department. They used to come to our drills. I mean, these were full on drills, right? Fire department would come. The fire people would go up and check the building, but we would check a record of the people that were standing outside and the people on the book who had come to work. And if there was anybody's name who had come to work who wasn't standing outside, we'd send the firemen in to get them. And so, I mean, it was kind of serious, they were taking it kind of serious. And I think I mentioned in a previous lesson how we took seriously also the actual room where our mainframe computers were. So how do we go about planning for this? Well, obviously we need to put some numbers around it, and so we put some figures on just how much will we lose if there's a disaster, and put some priorities on it, and we put some time regarding it, and these type of things, and that's what we talk about here, I think. So we have this thing called a business impact analysis. So your business impact analysis is basically just going to be, as I said, putting some numbers down. This is what we lose in the case of a disaster. And then we take some hard decisions. Can we afford to lose that? No, we can't. All right. So how much should we do to make sure that we don't lose it? And maybe we can look at two things. How do we stop the risk so that doesn't happen, or can we recover from it? And that's what we do here. So we come up with a risk assessment. What are the types of, and so have a look at this. When we're doing the risk assessment, we need to know how likely is it? And this is maybe the mistake that you could forgive the people in Texas for making. Not the people in Japan, I think, though, right? I mean, it's not like they don't have an earthquake in Japan very often. But usually these events, we'll call them like a 300-year event or a 1,000-year event or a 200-year event. I don't know if you know the history of Japan at all. But Japan, you may have heard of the Mongol invasion, Genghis Khan. And he actually with his armies, got as far as Baghdad. I mean, he sacked Baghdad and Hungary in Europe. So I mean, he went through a lot of the world, but he didn't get to Japan. And he did send a army navy from the coast of China, which he had conquered, to try and invade Japan. And but what happened is just as his boats were out there in the water trying to get to Japan, there was a tsunami, kind of like the one that destroyed Fukushima, except it destroyed the Chinese Mongol army invading army. So China didn't get to invade Japan in that time, and that was lucky for the Japanese. But the point that I'm making with that is that it's not like they didn't know that they have tsunamis. They pretty much got an idea that that might happen. And in fact, so I've been in Japan in a building there, a hotel, right? I'm on the 7th floor of the hotel, and all of a sudden it starts feeling kind of weird. And, the building's moving, and that's because there's an earthquake. It happens all the time, right? I mean, that was like a 3, 4, or 5 on the Richter scale or something. My son's living in Japan now, and he said they had a 7.8 there last week. And, they woke him up while they were asleep in their bed. Um, I think the Fukushima thing was in the 9, so that's that's a logarithmic scale, so it increases by multiple of 10. So so if a 9 is like 100 times more powerful than a 7. Anyway, so yeah, Japan, they need to plan for earthquakes, right? And Texas. Yeah, they do get freezing, as it seems, every 30 or 40 years, and they need to plan for that. Okay, so yeah, so the thing is, what is the likelihood? And that's the mistake that the Texas people made, is they thought, well, you know what? Maybe they are listening to the stuff about the global warming, right? We all know about global warming. I don't know. It's like, hey, because Al Gore was saying like 5 years ago that soon there won't be any snow anymore. Turns out there is. So I don't know. It's kind of confusing, isn't it? All right, so they determined that the likelihood was not high enough to worry about putting defrosters on their windmills, and they paid the price, right? So they determined they didn't have a good enough number for likelihood. The potential impact, whatever they thought the potential impact was before, they got a better idea of it now, I'm guessing. Potential impact could be kind of bad. And so, as I said, if you're in with your business, you're an insurance company, you're a government department, you're a hospital, you're a telephone company, you're a bank, these things, the likelihood might be the same for everybody, but the potential impact will be different, right? So you're a school, like we are, right? So our computers go down. Yeah, okay, but nobody's going to die, right? I mean, so our computers go down. The students are all happy because they take a holiday for a week while we get our computers going again. And that's the thing, right? But say you're a hospital, and people start dying, right? Say you're a bank, it goes down, and then people don't have their money, and they become very unhappy. So yeah, so depending on what your business is, that's how you're going to look at that impact. It's going to be different for each one. And so once you've done or as you're doing the impact analysis, notice the word we use here is to quantify. We're putting numbers beside it. We're putting numbers beside it because in the end, we're going to have to assign some numbers that are currency numbers, money, to avoiding the risk or helping a recovery. 2 points: either reduce the risk or quickly get a recovery, or both. And so, but we need a number. And so what we do is we do all these kinds of sort of weird mathematics. And to be honest, it's made up, but at least we've got something, right? It's not like the law of gravity. It's not that good of math, but it's something. We have to have something to base it on, and it's going to be on the best sort of experience within the industry and our managers. And so they'll come up with some numbers that they think, well, this is what we think the impact will be. This is what we think we can do to reduce it. We don't mind spending that kind of money on it. Let's put that in our plan. And so when we're doing that, we look at all of our processes, we look at all of our functions within our business, and we can see what is critical and what's non-critical. So our critical business things, if they go down, that could be existential. That could mean the end of our business. The time that we've got to sort of get them back up is going to be less. with our non-critical, these things can still be important, but we've got some time to get them going before it starts impacting on the business. We still have to fix them, but maybe we got some time to get around to that. And so we use this idea of time. So the shorter the time that we can afford to be down, the more it's going to cost us if we are down. And therefore, the more seriously we need to look at reducing that risk. And therefore, maybe the more we might have to pay to sort of make sure that that risk is not there, or to reduce that risk. So what do I mean by reducing that risk? Well, I mentioned it before, right? We could add redundancy. Now, in our notes, we talk about single point of failure, and I'm sure that you've talked about that in your course, in your other courses as well. So we identify those, and we say, well, that's not good. Can't have that single point of failure. How do we reduce that? Well, we add some redundancy, and we'll talk about that. So we have our high impact and low impact, and I think I've sort of talked about that. With the high impact, our risk is going to be high. And with the low impact, it could be that there's still a risk, but maybe it is not until there's a bit more time. We've got a bit of time to sort of overcome that. Okay, so what are some things that we can do? We can back up our data. We can have backups of our hardware and our redundancy in our networks. We can monitor what's going on so we can see that things are under control. And all of those things can be forced to happen, or as best we can do to force things to happen by having a plan and having people agree to that plan and having people follow that plan. And so that's what we want to do, right? So we're talking about the risk, and we need to sort of do an analysis of that. That means that should be updated regularly, that perhaps in a yearly plan or something like that. And because new risks will arrive depending on the environment that we're in, and we see that there's lots of things here that can relate to that risk. And so, as I mentioned a minute ago, we want to reduce our single points of failure. And the easy way to do that, easy but not cheap, is to build in redundancy. Or we can develop recovery options, which so we accept the fact that we have a risk that we could have a huge outage, a disaster, but we have a recovery policy which is applicable to the level of risk that we have. So a minute ago, I mentioned that there's two ways we look at this: reduce the risk or make the recovery. And we can look at them hand in hand, and they do relate slightly differently depending on the priority and how much time we have with our before things become really, really critical. If we've only got a couple of minutes or seconds before this sort of destroys our business model, then we are going to be focusing on the risk. But if we've got some time, it's okay if our systems are down for a week or so, then maybe what we want to be looking at is how do we get to our recovery, more emphasis on that. Now, this time diagram relates to two of the metrics that we have in our disaster planning, which is the time, recovery time. That is, we look forward. How much time do we have from the point of a disaster until the system is recovered before we start suffering really, really badly? That time we're going to call our RTO, right? Then looking backward, we look to how far back can we go? What's in terms of our backups of our data and our systems before it becomes critical that if we lose the amount of transactions that have occurred in this time, if we lose those transactions, how much of those transactions can we lose before it threatens our business completely? And so RTO going forward and RPO coming backwards. The recovery points, RPO is going backwards. And so depending on how much of those transactions we can actually afford to lose, if you're a bank, I'd say it's not very much, right? You can't. So depending on that, we will implement our redundancy in our systems and our backups. And so what we can do to do that, you can see this is all about redundancy, right? Data replication over multiple sites. I told you that's what we did in Telecom Australia. Distributed databases, RAID systems, which is a bunch of distributed systems, right? Clustering, optical storage offsite, all of those things. We're going to reduce this time of the RPO. We're going to have less of our transactions lost in the disaster, and maybe we're hoping for none, right? So those things, uninterruptible power supplies, RAID arrays, which is your massively redundant arrays of hard drives or servers, spare components, elimination of single points of failure, outsourcing, more than one provider, all about redundancy. Now we're talking about recovery, and so you would have heard these terms, I imagine, in some other connection, but warm, cold, and hot recoveries. So what we're talking about there is, can we have another site on which we can run our systems if this site catastrophically is lost? So imagine our computer center was sort of inundated by the tidal wave. Well, in the first place, if we planned properly, our computer center wouldn't be down there where there's a tidal wave. But supposing that we don't have much choice because we're Japan or something. Well, Japan's got mountains. They don't need to put computer systems on them. Well, anyways, suppose we, for some reason, we have a system and we're a bit worried about it crashing. So what can we do? We could have some kind of a system of being able to start up somewhere else in the event that this one went down. Now, in Telecom Australia, I told you we used to run the same systems in Melbourne as in Sydney. That's a hot backup. Why it's hot is because they're both running at the same time. One goes out, we don't even miss a beat. We still have our systems running, and so that's hot, and that's because that data was so critical, and those systems are so critical. You can have a cold system though, where you just have an arrangement with somebody, and they have a bunch of computers that you can just go and install all your software on and start running your system. And that'll probably take you a little bit of time to get going. That's why we call it cold. With cold, it takes more time. With warm, it's sort of halfway in between. Maybe you've got some computers that got your systems installed on them, but we haven't got our data over there. And so we need to move our data over in the event of a disaster, and that would be warm. Now, what comes to mind with those kind of things would be, for example, in banks, and there are sort of agreements that major banks have in the United States and Europe, I believe. And so what will happen is they will make an agreement with other banks that in the event of of their system going down, the other bank will lend them hardware for them to run their systems on. And that would be kind of like a warm, or sorry, that would be your cold. So that they'll lend them their excess capacity for them to install their systems on there and get them up and running. And so that's kind of agreement that would give you a cold standby. You're warm, you're going to have your hardware is going to be available, and all you need to do is sort of install your data usually. And fast recovery, that's what I mentioned. For example, I think here it talks about less than 24 hours. I'm thinking in terms of like immediate, like in like we had in Australia. Well, that's here, immediate. That's expensive, hugely expensive, more expensive than just running twice the amount of your thing, because you also have to have the real-time updates. So it's very, very expensive to have immediate recovery. So that's only going to be in systems where it's critical not to have a down. Okay, so I'm going to stop there because we got like 4 minutes before we run out on our time. So I'm just going